The rope creaked against the wooden beam as Jane Lawson watched in horror, her hands tied behind her back while Sheriff Bartholomew Miles adjusted the noose around her brother Matthew's neck. The crowd that had gathered in the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, Colorado, in the summer of 1878, muttered and shifted uneasily as the young man professed his innocence one final time. "I didn't steal those horses. I was framed." Matthew's voice cracked with desperation, his eyes seeking out his sister's tear-streaked face. At 21, he was too young to die, especially for a crime he hadn't committed. Sarah Jane struggled against her bonds, her wheat blonde hair falling across her face as she fought to free herself. At 19, she had already lost their parents to typhoid 2 years prior. Matthew was all she had left in this world. "Sheriff, you're making a terrible mistake," she cried out, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd. Sheriff Miles turned toward her with a cold smile. "Miss Lawson, your brother was caught red-handed with stolen property. The law is clear about horse thieves in these parts." What the sheriff didn't say was that Matthew had refused to sell their small but valuable family ranch to Miles' cousin, a wealthy cattle baron who wanted to expand his territory. This hanging wasn't justice, it was theft wrapped in the guise of the law. The sound of thundering hooves suddenly cut through the tension. A lone rider appeared at the far end of the street, his horse kicking up clouds of dust as he raced toward the gallows. The crowd parted as the rider pulled his stallion to a halt at the foot of the wooden platform. "Stop this hanging!" The man's voice rang out clear and strong, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. Sarah Jane looked up, hope sparking in her chest for the first time that terrible day. Frederick Kincaid sat tall in his saddle, his face partially shadowed by the brim of his worn leather hat. At 26, he was already known throughout the territory as one of the fastest guns and fairest men around. His piercing blue eyes locked onto the sheriff's, unwavering and determined. "This ain't your concern, Kincaid," Sheriff Miles spat. "We got a horse thief here and justice is being served." Frederick dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the dirt. "That's not what I heard. I was just in Silverton, where a man confessed to stealing those horses and planting evidence on the Lawson boy." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Frederick's reputation for honesty was well known throughout the territory. "I don't believe you," the sheriff snarled, though uncertainty flickered across his face. "Then perhaps you'll believe this." Frederick reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded document. "Signed confession, witnessed by Judge Parker himself. I rode all night to get here in time." Sheriff Miles' face flushed red with anger. "That means nothing. I'm the law in Redemption Creek. The law serves justice, not your cousin's greed," Frederick replied, loud enough for the crowd to hear. Gasps and whispers spread through the onlookers. Frederick strode forward, undeterred by the deputy who moved to block his path. "If you hang an innocent man today, everyone here will be witness to murder, not justice." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah Jane held her breath, her gaze fixed on this stranger who had appeared like an avenging angel. "I demand you release him immediately," Frederick continued, his voice steady and authoritative. "Unless you want the territorial governor to hear about how you're conducting justice in this town." The sheriff's face contorted with fury, but the muttering of the crowd was growing louder. Public opinion was swiftly turning against him. Several respected townspeople stepped forward, no longer willing to remain silent. "Sheriff, if there's evidence the boy is innocent, you can't hang him," said Abigail Monroe, the schoolteacher. "Let's see that confession," demanded Harold Whitman, the town's banker. Seeing his control of the situation slipping away, Sheriff Miles made a desperate decision. He nodded to his deputy, who pulled the lever releasing the trapdoor. With lightning reflexes, Frederick drew his pistol and shot through the rope just as Matthew began to fall. The young man dropped to the ground beneath the gallows platform instead of hanging, gasping and clutching at his throat as the partially tightened noose was cut away by a sympathetic townsperson. Chaos erupted. Sheriff Miles drew his gun, but Frederick was faster, shooting the weapon from the sheriff's hand. The crowd surged forward, some supporting the sheriff, others moving to protect Matthew. In the confusion, Frederick fought his way to Sarah Jane, cutting her bonds with his knife. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. "Get your brother and follow me," he instructed, his voice low and urgent. "I have horses waiting at the edge of town. Why are you helping us?" Sarah Jane asked, even as she moved to help Matthew to his feet. "Because I've seen too many innocent people die at the hands of corrupt men with badges," Frederick replied. "Now hurry." The three of them slipped away in the chaos, making it to Frederick's horses before the alarm was raised. As they galloped away from Redemption Creek, Sarah Jane looked over her shoulder at the only home she had ever known, uncertain if she would ever see it again. What she didn't know then was that this day marked not just their escape from injustice, but the beginning of a journey that would change all their lives forever. 3 days later, they made camp in a secluded valley nestled in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. Matthew had recovered somewhat from his ordeal, though the bruise around his neck remained a dark reminder of how close he had come to death. "How much farther to this safe place you mentioned?" Sarah Jane asked as she stirred the beans cooking over their small fire. She had changed from her town dress into a pair of her brother's old trousers and a shirt Frederick had given her, finding them much more practical for riding. Frederick looked up from cleaning his revolver. "Another 2 days' ride. It's an old mining claim that belongs to a friend of mine." "Sheriff Miles won't find us there." Matthew coughed, his voice still raspy from the rope burn. "We can't thank you enough, Mr. Kincaid, but I don't understand why you've risked so much for strangers." Frederick's eyes turned distant, focusing on something beyond their small camp. 2 years ago, my younger brother was accused of rustling cattle. The local sheriff, a man not unlike Miles, didn't bother with a trial. They strung him up the same day they caught him." His voice hardened. "Found out later the real rustlers paid the sheriff to look the other way and pin it on someone else." Sarah Jane's heart clenched at his story. "I'm so sorry," Frederick nodded, acknowledging her sympathy. "After that, I made it my business to look into cases where things didn't seem right. When I heard about your situation in Silverton, a young man about to hang for horse theft when the actual thief had been bragging in saloons 50 miles away, I had to intervene." "How did you know where to find the real thief?" Matthew asked. "I didn't at first. But I've spent the last year tracking down corruption like this. People talk, especially when they're drunk or when they think no one important is listening." Frederick reassembled his revolver with practiced ease. "The confession I showed was real. I tracked down the thief in Silverton, and with a little persuasion and the promise of a reduced sentence, he admitted to framing you." Sarah Jane studied Frederick's face in the flickering firelight. There was a hardness there, certainly the mark of a man who had seen too much cruelty, but also a deep sense of honor that she found herself drawn to. "What will happen to our ranch?" she asked quietly. Frederick sighed. "I wish I had better news." "By now, Sheriff Miles has probably declared you both fugitives. It won't be long before his cousin makes a move on your property." Matthew's fists clenched. "Everything our parents worked for. We'll get it back," Sarah Jane said with sudden determination. "Somehow we'll prove Matthew's innocence and reclaim what's ours." Frederick looked at her with newfound respect. "It won't be easy. Men like Sheriff Miles don't give up power without a fight." "Neither do I," Sarah Jane replied, meeting his gaze steadily. For the first time since they'd met, Frederick smiled a genuine smile that transformed his weather-worn face. "I believe you, Miss Lawson." "Sarah Jane, please," she said. "After saving my brother's life and mine, I think you've earned the right to use my given name." Something shifted in Frederick's expression, a softening that made Sarah Jane's heart beat a little faster. "Then you must call me Frederick." That night, as Matthew slept, Sarah Jane sat beside Frederick by the dying embers of their fire. The stars stretched endlessly above them, brilliant against the black canvas of the night sky. "Tell me about your ranch," Frederick said softly. Sarah Jane closed her eyes, picturing the home she feared she might never see again. "It's not large, but the land is good." Our father chose it for the creek that runs year-round and the natural shelter provided by the hills. We have had about 30 head of cattle and some of the finest horses in the territory. Pride colored her voice. Matthew has a way with horses. He can gentle the wildest Mustang given enough time. And you, what's your special talent? Sarah Jane smiled. I keep the books. Father made sure I could read, write, and cipher as well as any man. Mother taught me to shoot, cook, and mend. Between the two of them, I suppose they raised me to be ready for anything. Her smile faltered. Except losing them both to typhoid when I was 17. Frederick was quiet for a moment. You've carried a heavy burden for someone so young. We all have our burdens, she replied, glancing at him. You've been carrying yours alone from the sound of it. It's easier that way, he said. No one else gets hurt. Is it really? Easier, I mean. Sarah Jane's question hung in the air between them. Frederick studied her face in the dim light. No, he admitted finally. It's not easier, just safer. Sometimes safety is overrated, she said softly. Sometimes you need someone to watch your back. Their eyes held for a long moment, and Sarah Jane felt something stir within her, a connection she hadn't expected to form with this quiet, dangerous man. The moment was broken when a twig snapped in the darkness beyond their camp. Frederick was on his feet instantly, gun drawn. Stay down, he whispered, motioning for Sarah Jane to wake Matthew. Heart pounding, she shook her brother awake while Frederick moved silently toward the source of the noise. Matthew instinctively reached for the rifle beside his bedroll. A tense minute passed, then Frederick's voice came from the darkness. It's just a deer, we're safe. As he returned to the firelight, Sarah Jane released the breath she'd been holding. I thought it might be the sheriff's men. Miles doesn't know these mountains, Frederick said, though his expression remained vigilant. But we should move on at first light just to be safe. Matthew nodded and returned to his bedroll, but Sarah Jane remained by the fire. You should rest, Frederick told her. I will. But first, thank you, not just for saving Matthew, but for believing us when no one else would. Frederick holstered his gun and sat down beside her again. Sometimes faith is all we have. In the quiet that followed, Sarah Jane felt the wall around her heart begin to crumble. She had spent the past 2 years being strong for Matthew, never allowing herself to lean on anyone. Yet here, beside this stranger who had risked everything for them, she found herself wanting to trust again. Little did she know that Frederick was experiencing a similar awakening, a realization that perhaps his solitary crusade for justice didn't have to be walked alone after all. Dawn broke over the mountains in a spectacular display of pink and gold. They broke camp quickly and continued their journey, following game trails that wound through dense pine forests and across rushing streams. As they rode, Frederick shared more about the mining claim that would be their sanctuary. It belongs to Jonas Weber, an old prospector who struck silver back in '63. He's in San Francisco now, but he lets me use the cabin whenever I need a place to lie low. And you think we'll be safe there? Matthew asked, adjusting the bandana around his neck to hide the rope burn. For a while at least, Frederick replied. It's remote, about 2 miles up a box canyon with only one way in or out, easy to defend if it comes to that. Sarah Jane considered this. What's your plan after we reach the cabin? We can't hide forever. Frederick glanced at her, impressed by her practical thinking. I have contacts in Denver, a lawyer who specializes in land disputes, and a former marshal who still has influence with the territorial governor. If we can get affidavits from the real horse thief and witnesses from Silverton, we might be able to clear Matthew's name and expose Sheriff Miles. And if that doesn't work, Sarah Jane pressed, Frederick's expression turned grim, then we look for another way. Justice isn't always found in courtrooms, but I promise you this: I won't stop until your brother's name is cleared and you can return to your land. Sarah Jane studied his profile, wondering about the man behind the determined exterior. Why does this matter so much to you? Beyond what happened to your brother, I mean. Frederick was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, because someone has to stand against men like Miles. The West is changing. Towns are growing, the railroad is coming, and there's money to be made. Some men see the law as a tool to take what they want, not as a shield to protect the innocent. He looked at her directly. If good people don't fight back, what kind of world are we building out here? His words resonated deeply with Sarah Jane. Her parents had come west with dreams of building something that would last, something honest and true. They hadn't fled civilization, they'd hoped to create a better version of it. Then we'll fight back, she said simply. Together. Frederick's eyes widened slightly at her declaration, and for a moment, Sarah Jane thought she glimpsed something like hope in their blue depths. The moment was interrupted by Matthew, who had ridden ahead and now came galloping back toward them. "Riders coming," he said urgently. "4 of them about a mile back." Frederick's expression hardened. "Could be coincidence, but we can't risk it. There's a ravine about half a mile ahead. We'll leave the trail there and double back through the stream bed." They urged their horses to a gallop, racing against time and the approaching riders. Sarah Jane's heart thundered in her chest, not just from fear but from a surge of determination. She would not be captured, would not let Matthew face that noose again. They reached the ravine and guided their horses down its steep embankment. Cold water splashed around the animals' fetlocks as they picked their way carefully along the rocky stream bed. "Keep under the tree cover," Frederick instructed in a low voice, "and stay quiet." They moved slowly upstream, fighting the current and listening intently for any sound of pursuit. After what seemed like hours but was likely only 20 minutes, Frederick motioned for them to stop and dismounted. He tied his horse to a low, hanging branch and crept back the way they had come, moving silently from rock to rock. Sarah Jane exchanged a worried glance with Matthew, who looked pale but determined. Her brother had always been gentle-natured, more interested in training horses than fighting, but the past few days had awakened something harder in him. Frederick returned 10 minutes later, his expression grim. "It's Miles' men, all right, 4 deputies heavily armed. They're searching the main trail, but it won't be long before they find where we turned off." "What do we do?" Matthew asked. Frederick considered their options. "We need to split up, it's the only way." "No," Sarah Jane protested immediately. "We stay together." "Listen to me," Frederick said, his voice intense but quiet. "If we all go together and they catch us, we're all done for. But if we separate, at least some of us have a chance." "He's right, Sarah Jane," Matthew said reluctantly. "Strategically, it makes sense." She wanted to argue further, but the sound of voices echoing down the ravine made her blood run cold. The deputies were getting closer. "Here's what we'll do," Frederick said quickly. "Matthew, you'll take my horse. He's the strongest and fastest. Head due north for about 15 miles until you reach a cabin with a red door. Ask for Hank Booker. Tell him Frederick sent you and that you need to get to Denver." "What about you two?" Matthew asked, glancing between Frederick and his sister. "Sarah Jane and I will create a diversion, then circle back and meet you at Booker's place." Frederick handed Matthew a folded map. "If we're not there by sunset tomorrow, keep going to Denver. Find Judge Parker on Lawrence Street." Sarah Jane's stomach knotted with fear, but she nodded. It was a sound plan, even if she hated the thought of separating from her brother. Matthew hugged her fiercely. "Stay safe," he whispered. "I can't lose you too." "You won't," she promised. "Now go." They watched as Matthew mounted Frederick's stallion and rode deeper into the ravine, staying in the water to mask his tracks. When he disappeared around a bend, Frederick turned to Sarah Jane. "Ready to create a diversion?" he asked. Despite the danger, Sarah Jane felt a flutter of excitement. "What did you have in mind?" Frederick grinned, and for a moment he looked younger, almost boyish. "How are you with explosives?" 10 minutes later, they had positioned themselves on a ridge overlooking the main trail. Frederick had retrieved a small package of dynamite from his saddlebags before giving his horse to Matthew. "Mining towns always have a use for dynamite," he explained as he prepared the charge. "I never travel without some, just in case." Sarah Jane watched him work, impressed by his efficiency. "You've done this before." "Once or twice," he admitted. "When I was prospecting before." He didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah Jane understood. Before his brother's murder, the voices of the deputies grew louder as they approached the spot where the tracks left the main trail. "Boss, I found something," one of them called out. Looks like they went down into the ravine. Frederick nodded to Sarah Jane. Get ready to run. He lit the fuse and they both ducked down behind a large boulder. Seconds later, the explosion rocked the forest, sending birds scattering from the trees and echoing off the canyon walls. What the hell was that? They heard one of the deputies shout. Sounded like it came from over there. Another responded. They must be trying to bring the rocks down on us. Let's go. Frederick grabbed Sarah Jane's hand, and they ran in the opposite direction from where the deputies were now heading, drawn by the explosion. They moved quickly through the forest, ducking under branches and scrambling over fallen logs. Sarah Jane was grateful for the trousers she wore, which allowed her to keep pace with Frederick much better than a dress would have. After about a mile, they paused to catch their breath in a small clearing. Frederick listened intently, then nodded with satisfaction. I don't hear them following. The diversion worked. For now, Sarah Jane said, but they'll figure it out eventually. By then, we'll be long gone. Frederick checked the position of the sun. We need to head northeast if we want to reach Booker's cabin by tomorrow. Sarah Jane looked at him curiously. This Booker, is he a friend? Of sorts, Frederick replied. We served together in the war. He's not much for conversation, but he's loyal to a fault and hates corrupt lawmen almost as much as I do. You were in the war? Sarah Jane asked, surprised. Frederick would have been just a boy when the Civil War ended, last year of it, lied about my age to enlist. His expression turned distant, saw enough killing to last several lifetimes. Sarah Jane's respect for this complex man deepened. Is that why you're so determined to prevent unjust deaths now? Frederick looked at her sharply, as if surprised by her insight. Maybe never thought about it that way. He offered her a canteen. We should keep moving. They walked for hours, keeping to game trails and avoiding open spaces where they might be spotted. As the sun began to set, Frederick found a sheltered spot beneath an overhang where they could rest for the night. It's not much, he apologized, but it'll keep us dry if it rains. It's fine, Sarah Jane assured him. I've slept in worse places. Frederick raised an eyebrow. Have you now? I thought you were a ranch girl. Ranch work isn't all sunshine and roses, she replied with a small smile. I've spent plenty of nights out in the open looking for lost calves or waiting out storms. They gathered wood for a small fire, keeping it well shielded to avoid detection. With night falling, the temperature dropped rapidly, and Sarah Jane found herself shivering despite the fire's warmth. Without a word, Frederick removed his coat and draped it around her shoulders. The garment was still warm from his body, and it carried his scent leather, gunpowder, and something uniquely him. Thank you, she said quietly, but won't you be cold? I've got a thick hide, he replied with a slight smile. Comes from years of sleeping rough. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the forest around them. Sarah Jane found herself studying Frederick's face in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw, the small scar above his right eyebrow, the way his eyes seemed to hold both sadness and determination. What will you do? She asked suddenly. After all this is over, I mean. After you've helped us clear Matthew's name, Frederick poked at the fire with a stick. I haven't thought that far ahead. There's always another corrupt official somewhere, another innocent person in need of help. That sounds like a lonely life, he looked up at her. I suppose it is. Have you ever thought about stopping, finding a place to settle down? Frederick was quiet for so long that Sarah Jane thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, sometimes. When I was younger, I dreamed of having my own ranch someday, a place where things made sense and justice was simple. He shook his head. Foolish dreams. I don't think they're foolish at all, Sarah Jane said softly. Dreams are what keep us going when everything else falls apart. Their eyes met across the fire, and something passed between them, an understanding, a connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. Frederick cleared his throat and looked away first. You should get some sleep. I'll take first watch. Sarah Jane wanted to protest, to continue their conversation, but she could see that he had retreated behind his walls again. Respecting his need for space, she made herself as comfortable as possible on the hard ground, using his coat as both pillow and blanket. As she drifted toward sleep, she heard Frederick moving quietly around their small camp, checking their surroundings. Despite the danger they faced, she felt oddly safe in his presence, protected in a way she hadn't felt since her parents died. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was that Frederick Kincaid was a far more complex man than he appeared at first glance, and she found herself increasingly drawn to the mysteries he kept hidden behind those watchful blue eyes. Morning came all too soon, heralded by birdsong and the soft golden light filtering through the trees. Sarah Jane woke to find Frederick already up, returning from what appeared to be a hunting expedition with 2 rabbits. "Breakfast," he said simply, setting about preparing the meal with practiced efficiency. Sarah Jane stretched, working out the stiffness from sleeping on the ground. "Did you sleep at all?" "A few hours," he replied, though the shadows under his eyes suggested otherwise. They ate quickly, both aware of the need to reunite with Matthew as soon as possible. As they were preparing to leave, Frederick suddenly froze, his hand moving to his gun. "Someone's coming," he whispered, pulling Sarah Jane behind a large boulder. They waited in tense silence as the sound of footsteps grew louder. Sarah Jane held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it would give them away. A man appeared in the clearing, not one of the deputies, but a trapper by the look of his fur-trimmed coat and the traps he carried. He paused, studying their abandoned campsite with curiosity. Frederick and Sarah Jane remained perfectly still until the trapper shrugged and continued on his way, apparently deciding that whoever had camped there was long gone. "That was close," Sarah Jane breathed once the man was out of earshot. "Too close," Frederick agreed. "We need to be more careful. Word about us will be spreading." They set off again, moving through the forest with greater caution. Around midday, they came upon a small stream and stopped to refill their canteens. As Sarah Jane knelt by the water, she caught sight of her reflection and barely recognized herself. Her blonde hair was tangled and dirty, her face smudged with dust and soot from the fire. She had changed so much in just a few days, not just in appearance, but inside as well. The sheltered ranch girl was gone, replaced by someone harder, more determined. "What are you thinking?" Frederick asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "That I'm not the same person I was when you found us in Redemption Creek," she admitted. "I feel different." Frederick nodded in understanding. Danger changes people, sometimes for the better, sometimes not. "And which is it for me?" she asked, genuinely curious about his assessment. He studied her for a moment, his gaze direct and unfiltered. "Definitely for the better. You were brave before, but now you know it. That makes all the difference." His words warmed her in a way that had nothing to do with the midday sun. "And what about you? Has all this changed you too?" A faint smile touched his lips. "More than I expected." Before she could ask what he meant, the crack of a rifle shot shattered the tranquil scene. The bullet struck the water inches from where Sarah Jane knelt, sending up a spray that drenched her. "Get down." Frederick shouted, diving toward her and pulling her behind a fallen log as more shots rang out. "Where are they?" Sarah Jane gasped, her heart racing. Frederick peered carefully over the log. "Ridge to the east, looks like 2 of them." He drew his revolver. "Stay here." "What are you going to do?" "Create another diversion." He checked his ammunition. "When I start shooting, I want you to run north along the stream bed. Stay low and don't stop until you reach those rocks about 100 yards up." "I'm not leaving you," Sarah Jane protested. Frederick's expression softened for a moment. "I'll be right behind you, I promise." Before she could argue further, he sprang up and fired 3 rapid shots toward the ridge, then darted in the opposite direction. The attacker's attention followed him, bullets kicking up dirt at his heels. Sarah Jane hesitated only a second before following his instructions, staying low as she splashed through the shallow stream toward the rocks he had indicated. She reached them safely and pressed herself against the cool stone, gasping for breath. More gunshots echoed through the forest, followed by a shout of pain that wasn't Frederick's voice. Then silence fell, heavy and ominous. Sarah Jane held her breath, straining to hear any sound that would tell her Frederick was all right. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one increasing her fear. Just as she was about to risk calling out, Frederick appeared around the bend in the stream, moving quickly but apparently unhurt. Relief flooded through her, so intense that her knees nearly buckled. "Are you all right?" "Fine," he assured her, though he was breathing hard. "One of them is dead, the other one ran off." "Were they Sheriff Miles' men?" Frederick shook his head. "Bounty hunters from the look of them. Miles must have put a price on our heads." This news sent a chill through Sarah Jane. Bounty hunters were often more dangerous than lawmen, less constrained by rules and more determined, motivated by money rather than justice. "We need to move faster," Frederick said grimly. "They know roughly where we are now." They pushed on with renewed urgency, stopping only when absolutely necessary. By late afternoon, they had covered considerable ground, but Frederick grew increasingly concerned about their exposed position as they approached less forested terrain. "We'll have to wait until dark to cross this open country," he decided as they surveyed the rolling meadows ahead. "Too easy to spot us otherwise." They found shelter in a dense thicket of brush and settled in to wait for nightfall. The forced inactivity made Sarah Jane restless, her mind replaying the events of the past few days. "You think Matthew made it safely to your friend's cabin?" she asked, unable to keep the worry from her voice. Frederick gave her a reassuring smile. "Matthew seems like a capable young man, and my horse knows the way to Booker's place. I'd bet good money they're there already, probably enjoying a hot meal while we're hiding in the bushes." His attempt to lighten her mood worked, drawing a small smile from her. "Matthew's always been the lucky one. When we were children, he could fall into a mud puddle and come up with a gold nugget. And you," I was the practical one. "While Matthew was dreaming about breaking wild mustangs, I was making sure the fences were mended and the accounts balanced." She plucked absently at a blade of grass. "Our parents always said we complemented each other perfectly, his dreams and my practicality." "They sound like wise people," Frederick observed. "They were." Sarah Jane's voice softened with memory. "They taught us that honor and integrity matter more than wealth or status. That's why I can't let Sheriff Miles steal our land. It's not just about the property, it's about everything my parents stood for." Frederick nodded in understanding. "We'll get it back, I promise you that." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, Sarah Jane found herself studying Frederick's profile again. In the golden light, the hardness that usually characterized his features seemed softened, revealing the younger man beneath the tough exterior. "May I ask you something personal?" she ventured. He turned to look at her, one eyebrow raised in question. "Before all this, before your brother died, what were you like? Were you always so?" She searched for the right word. "Solitary." A shadow crossed his face, but to her surprise, he answered, "No, I was different then, more trusting, more foolish, perhaps." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "I even had a fiancé." This revelation startled Sarah Jane. Somehow, she hadn't imagined Frederick as a man who had come close to marriage. "What happened?" "After James, my brother, was killed, I became obsessed with finding the men responsible. I spent months tracking them down one by one." His voice turned hard. "Eleanor didn't understand why I couldn't just let the law handle it. When I finally returned, she had married someone else, a banker." The way he said the word made it sound like an insult. "I'm sorry," Sarah Jane said softly. Frederick shrugged. "Don't be, she was right to leave." The man who came back wasn't the one she had agreed to marry. He stood abruptly. "It's getting dark. We should move." Sarah Jane recognized his withdrawal, the way he used action to avoid emotion. It was a tactic she had employed herself many times after her parents' deaths. Rather than push him further, she rose and prepared to continue their journey. They crossed the open meadow under the cover of darkness, moving as quietly as possible. The moon provided just enough light to see by without making them too visible to anyone who might be watching. As they reached the tree line on the far side, Frederick suddenly gripped Sarah Jane's arm, pulling her down into a crouch. She followed his gaze and saw what had alarmed him, the glow of a campfire about half a mile away. "Could be innocent travelers," she whispered hopefully. "Could be," Frederick agreed, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "But we can't take that chance. We'll circle wide around them." The detour cost them precious time, but by dawn, they had reached a ridge that Frederick recognized. "Booker's cabin is just on the other side," he told Sarah Jane, relief evident in his voice. "We made it." The cabin came into view as they crested the ridge, a solid structure built of logs with a distinctive red door, just as Frederick had described to Matthew. Smoke rose from the chimney, a welcome sight that suggested warmth and safety waited within. As they approached, the door opened and Matthew stepped out, rifle in hand. When he recognized them, his face broke into a wide smile. "Sarah Jane, Frederick, thank God you're safe." He rushed forward to embrace his sister. Sarah Jane hugged him fiercely, tears of relief springing to her eyes. "I was so worried about you." "I got here yesterday afternoon," Matthew told them. "Mr. Booker has been keeping watch while I caught up on sleep." He turned to Frederick with gratitude shining in his eyes. "Your horse is amazing, smartest animal I've ever ridden." Frederick smiled, genuine pleasure warming his features. "Diablo knows his way around these mountains better than most men," a gruff voice called from the cabin. "Stop your jabbering and get inside before someone spots you." They turned to see a bear of a man filling the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered with a thick beard shot through with gray. His stern expression was belied by the concern in his eyes as he surveyed the newcomers. "Hank," Frederick greeted him with a nod. "Thanks for taking in our friend. Any enemy of corrupt lawmen is a friend of mine," Booker replied, stepping back to let them enter. "Besides, I owed you for that business in Durango." The cabin's interior was simple but comfortable, with a large fireplace dominating one wall and sturdy, handmade furniture arranged for practicality rather than aesthetics. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, making Sarah Jane suddenly aware of how hungry she was. "Sit," Booker commanded, gesturing to the table where plates of food waited. "Eat while we talk." They needed no further encouragement. As they ate, Frederick explained everything that had happened since they'd separated from Matthew. "Bounty hunters," Booker muttered darkly when Frederick mentioned the ambush at the stream. "Miles must be offering a good sum to draw them out." "All the more reason we need to get to Denver quickly," Frederick said. "Once we have the law on our side, Miles' authority ends." "It won't be easy," Booker warned. "The trail to Denver crosses open country for most of the way. You'll be visible for miles." "What about the old mining road?" Frederick suggested. "It's longer, but it keeps to the forest for most of the route." Booker considered this. "It's not been maintained in years, might be washed out in places, but you're right, it would offer better cover." He rose and moved to a chest in the corner from which he withdrew a rolled-up map. "Let me show you." As the men discussed routes and strategies, Sarah Jane found herself watching Frederick. The change in him since they'd arrived at the cabin was subtle but noticeable, a slight relaxation of the constant vigilance, a softening around the eyes. Here, with a trusted friend, he allowed himself to lower his guard just a fraction. It made her wonder about the man he might be if he ever felt truly safe, truly at peace. The thought stirred something within her, a longing to know that version of Frederick Kincaid. After the meal, Booker showed Sarah Jane to a small back room where she could wash and change into clean clothes. He had provided simple men's garments that were too large but infinitely cleaner than what she had been wearing. When she emerged, feeling somewhat refreshed, she found Frederick alone by the fireplace, studying the map Booker had given him. "Where are the others?" she asked. "Matthew's tending to the horses. Booker's gone to check his traps." Frederick looked up, his eyes widening slightly at her appearance. The oversized shirt was belted at the waist with a piece of rope, transforming it into something that almost resembled a dress. "I know I look ridiculous," she said with a self-conscious laugh, "but it's clean at least. You look." Frederick seemed to search for the right word. Different, but not ridiculous. Something in his tone made her cheeks warm. To hide her reaction, she moved to look at the map over his shoulder. "So what's the plan?" Frederick cleared his throat. "We'll leave at first light tomorrow. Take the old mining road to Denver. Should get us there in 3 days if we push hard. And then we meet with Judge Parker. He's a good man, incorruptible. If anyone can help us legally, it's him." Frederick traced a line on the map. The challenge will be reaching Denver without being caught. Once Miles realizes we're headed there, he'll do everything he can to stop us. Sarah Jane studied the map, noting the difficult terrain they would need to traverse. It won't be easy. No, Frederick agreed, but we've made it this far. Their eyes met, and Sarah Jane was struck by how close they were, standing close enough that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his body. For a moment, something electric seemed to pass between them, a current of unspoken feeling that made her breath catch. Frederick's gaze dropped briefly to her lips, then back to her eyes, a question in their depths. The moment was shattered by the sound of the door opening as Matthew returned from the stable. Frederick stepped back quickly, returning his attention to the map as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, Sarah Jane was certain of it. And from the slight flush coloring Frederick's cheeks, she suspected he knew it too. That evening, Booker entertained them with stories of his prospecting days, painting vivid pictures of the early mining camps and the characters who inhabited them. Despite the danger that still loomed over them, there was a sense of camaraderie in the cabin that Sarah Jane found deeply comforting. As the night grew late, Booker showed Matthew and Frederick where they would sleep. Matthew in the small back room Sarah Jane had used earlier, Frederick on a pallet near the fire. For Sarah Jane, Booker had arranged a makeshift bed behind a curtain in one corner of the main room. "It's not much for privacy," he apologized gruffly, "but it's the best I can offer." "It's perfect," Sarah Jane assured him. "Thank you for your hospitality." Sleep came more easily than she had expected, the exhaustion of the past few days finally catching up with her. But her dreams were troubled images of Matthew hanging from the gallows, of Frederick facing down an army of bounty hunters, of Sheriff Miles laughing as he took possession of her family's ranch. She woke with a start in the darkest hour of the night, a cry caught in her throat. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was, panic gripping her heart. "Sarah Jane?" Frederick's voice came softly from beyond the curtain. "Are you all right?" She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Just a nightmare. I'm sorry if I woke you." There was a pause, then the soft sound of footsteps approaching. Frederick appeared at the edge of the curtain, his figure silhouetted against the dim glow of the banked fire. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the chair beside her bed. Sarah Jane nodded, pulling her blanket up to her chin, though she was fully clothed beneath it. Frederick sat down, his expression hidden in shadow. "I get them too, the nightmares." "What do you dream about?" she asked softly. He was quiet for a moment. "My brother, the men I've killed." "The ones I couldn't save." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I dream about a different life, the one I might have had if James hadn't died." The vulnerability in his admission touched Sarah Jane deeply. "Do you think you'll ever find peace?" Frederick sighed. "I don't know. For a long time, I didn't think I wanted to. Peace felt like surrender, like I was accepting what happened." He shifted slightly, the firelight catching his profile. "But lately, I've been wondering if there might be another way to honor James' memory, a way that doesn't involve more killing." "What way is that?" "By living the kind of life he would have wanted for me, by finding happiness again." Frederick's voice had an uncertain quality Sarah Jane hadn't heard before. "At least, that's what I've been thinking these past few days." Sarah Jane's heart quickened at his words and the implication behind them. "What changed? These past few days, I mean." Frederick turned to look at her directly, and even in the dim light, the intensity of his gaze was unmistakable. "You did." The simple honesty of his answer took her breath away. Before she could respond, he stood up, as if suddenly aware of the intimacy of the moment. "You should try to get some rest," he said, his voice returning to its usual measured tone. "We have a long journey ahead of us." As he moved to return to his pallet, Sarah Jane called after him softly. "Frederick," he paused, looking back at her, "thank you for everything." A smile touched his lips, small but genuine. "Sleep well, Sarah Jane." As he disappeared beyond the curtain, Sarah Jane lay back, her mind racing with thoughts of what might have been if he had stayed, if she had found the courage to tell him that he had changed her two awakened feelings she had thought buried with her parents, with her old life. But perhaps it was better this way. Until Matthew was safe and their ranch secure, she couldn't afford the distraction of these newfound emotions. There would be time enough for such conversations when their immediate dangers were past. With that thought, she closed her eyes and drifted back to sleep, this time without nightmares to trouble her rest. Morning came all too soon. They rose before dawn, preparing for the journey ahead with quiet efficiency. Booker provided them with provisions, extra ammunition, and 3 fresh horses. "These aren't as fine as your Diablo," he told Frederick as they saddled the animals, "but they're mountain-bred and sure-footed. They'll serve you well on the mining road." Frederick clasped the older man's hand. "I can't thank you enough, Hank." Booker shrugged off the gratitude. "Just make sure Miles gets what's coming to him. That'll be thanks enough." As they prepared to depart, Booker pulled Frederick aside for a private word. Sarah Jane couldn't hear what was said, but she saw Frederick nod solemnly before returning to help her mount. "What was that about?" she asked as they rode away from the cabin, the first light of dawn breaking over the eastern mountains. Frederick's expression was unreadable. "Just some advice from an old friend." They rode in silence for the first hour, each lost in their own thoughts. The old mining road was indeed in poor condition. As Booker had warned, overgrown in places, washed out in others, but it provided the cover they needed, winding through dense forests and along the backs of ridges rather than through exposed valleys. Around midday, they paused to rest the horses and eat a cold lunch of jerky and hardtack. Matthew, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. "I've been thinking about what happens when we reach Denver," he said. "Even if Judge Parker believes us, what's to stop Miles from claiming we're lying? It's our word against his." Frederick nodded, acknowledging the concern. "That's why we need more than just our testimony. We need evidence of Miles' corruption, proof that he's been abusing his authority." "And how do we get that?" Sarah Jane asked. Frederick's expression turned thoughtful. "From what you've told me, Miles has been working with his cousin to push small ranchers off their land for years. We can't be the only victims." He paused, considering. "In Denver, we might be able to find others who have suffered similar injustices. Together, our stories would be harder to dismiss." "That's assuming we make it to Denver," Matthew pointed out, his tone somber. "We will," Frederick said with quiet confidence. "Miles is expecting us to take the main road. This route will buy us time." They continued their journey, the terrain growing increasingly rugged as they climbed higher into the mountains. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, promising rain before nightfall. "We should find shelter soon," Frederick advised, scanning the rocky landscape. "Mountain storms can be dangerous, especially on exposed ridges like this." They pushed on, seeking a suitable place to wait out the coming storm. Just as the first fat raindrops began to fall, Matthew spotted a dark opening in the cliff face ahead. "There," he called out, pointing. "Looks like an old mine entrance." Frederick frowned. "Abandoned mines can be unstable. Let me check it first." He dismounted and approached the opening cautiously, gun drawn. After a moment, he waved them forward. "It's safe. Just a shallow cave, not a mine shaft. The horses can fit too if we lead them carefully." They hurried inside just as the skies opened, rain coming down in sheets that turned the mining road into a muddy stream within minutes. The cave was dry and relatively spacious, with a high ceiling that allowed them to stand comfortably. "Good spotting, Matthew," Frederick said as they unsaddled the horses. "This will do nicely until the storm passes." They made a small fire near the entrance, using the dry wood Frederick had thought to collect earlier. As darkness fell outside, the storm intensified, lightning illuminating the landscape in brief, brilliant flashes followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very mountain. "I've always loved storms," Sarah Jane admitted as they sat around the fire, sharing a simple meal. "There's something cleansing about them, as if the world is being washed clean." Matthew smiled at his sister. "You used to frighten me with stories about thunder spirits during storms, remember?" Sarah Jane laughed. "I was a terrible older sister." "The best," Matthew corrected her. "Even when you were scaring me half to death." Frederick watched their easy interaction with a slight smile. "You two are close." We had to be, Sarah Jane said. After our parents died, we only had each other. Tell me about your ranch, Frederick said, settling back against his saddle. What makes it worth all this trouble? Matthew and Sarah Jane exchanged a glance. Then Matthew began to describe the property, the creek that never ran dry, the meadows that turned emerald green in spring, the view of the mountains from the front porch. But it's more than just land, Sarah Jane added. It's everything our parents worked for, everything they dreamed of passing down to us and our children someday. Her voice softened. I can still see my father standing on the hill behind the house, looking out over the valley at sunset. He used to say that was the moment when he knew God had led him to the right place. Frederick's expression was contemplative. It sounds like paradise. It's not perfect, Matthew admitted. Winters are harsh. The work never ends, but it's ours, or it was, Sarah Jane said, her tone hardening. Until Sheriff Miles decided to steal it. We'll get it back, Frederick promised, the words becoming a refrain between them. As the evening wore on, the storm began to abate, the thunder growing more distant. They decided to sleep in the cave rather than risk traveling the treacherous road at night. Frederick took the first watch, sitting near the cave entrance with his rifle across his knees. Sarah Jane tried to sleep but found herself restless, her mind too full of worries and questions. After an hour of tossing and turning, she gave up and joined Frederick at the entrance. He glanced up as she approached, his expression softening. "Can't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "Too much thinking?" "That can be dangerous," he said with a slight smile, "so I've been told." She sat down beside him, drawing her knees up to her chest. "May I ask you something?" "You seem to ask that a lot before asking your actual question," he observed, his tone gently teasing. Sarah Jane smiled. "I suppose I do. It's a habit from dealing with my brother." Matthew tends to bolt if questions get too personal. "And you think I might do the same?" "Sometimes," she admitted. "You keep your thoughts close." Frederick didn't deny it. "What's your question?" She looked out at the rain-washed night, gathering her courage. "Last night you said I changed something for you. What did you mean?" Frederick was silent for a long moment, and Sarah Jane feared she had pushed too far, but when he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "After James died, I stopped believing in much of anything. Justice, goodness, hope, they all seemed like fairy tales people tell themselves to feel better about a cruel world." He shifted slightly, his shoulder brushing against hers. "I've spent years tracking down men like Sheriff Miles, trying to balance scales that can never be balanced. And somewhere along the way, I forgot what I was fighting for. And now," Sarah Jane prompted softly when he paused, "now I'm remembering." Frederick turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the dying firelight. "Watching you with Matthew, hearing you talk about your home, seeing how fiercely you fight for what you believe, and it reminds me that there are still things in this world worth protecting. Worth living for, not just dying for." The sincerity in his voice made Sarah Jane's heart swell with emotion. "I think your brother would be proud of the man you've become," she said. Frederick gave a short, humorless laugh. "I'm not so sure about that. I've done things I'm not proud of." "Haven't we all?" Sarah Jane replied. "The measure of a person isn't in never making mistakes, but in how they try to make things right." She hesitated, then added, "and in who they choose to become after those mistakes." Frederick studied her face, something like wonder in his expression. "How did you get to be so wise at 19? 20 next month," she corrected with a small smile. "And I'm not wise, just stubborn. My father always said I could argue with a fence post and make it change its mind." That drew a genuine laugh from Frederick, a warm, rich sound that Sarah Jane realized she had rarely heard from him. It transformed his face, erasing the hard lines and making him look younger, more carefree. "I believe that," he said, still smiling. "I've seen how determined you can be." Their eyes held for a long moment, and Sarah Jane felt that same electric current between them that she had experienced at Booker's cabin. This time, however, there was no interruption to break the spell. Frederick's smile faded slowly, replaced by an intensity that made her breath catch. His gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, a question in their depths. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned toward her. Sarah Jane felt her heart racing as she met him halfway, their lips touching in a kiss that was tentative at first, then deepening as she responded with unexpected fervor. His hand came up to cup her cheek, gentle despite the calluses on his palm. Sarah Jane found herself leaning into his touch, every nerve in her body alive with sensation. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing faster. Frederick rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if savoring the moment. "I shouldn't have done that," he murmured, though he made no move to pull away. "Why not?" Sarah Jane asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because once this is over, you'll go back to your ranch and I'll—" He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. "You'll what?" She pressed. "Go back to wandering, to fighting other people's battles alone." Frederick opened his eyes, meeting her gaze. "It's what I do." "It's what you've done," she corrected him. "It doesn't have to be what you do forever." He pulled back slightly, studying her face with an unreadable expression. "What are you saying, Sarah Jane?" She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I'm saying that when this is over, when Matthew and I have our ranch back, there might be a place there for you too, if you wanted it." The vulnerability in her offer hung in the air between them. Frederick's expression softened, a mixture of wonder and uncertainty crossing his features. "I haven't had a real home in a very long time," he said quietly. "I'm not sure I'd remember how to live that kind of life." "Maybe you could learn," Sarah Jane suggested, "with the right people to remind you." Frederick's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining. "Maybe," he agreed, a new warmth in his voice, "when this is over." They sat together in companionable silence after that, watching as the storm clouds gradually dispersed, revealing a sky bright with stars. The promise of what might be waited on the other side of their current dangers, a future neither had dared to imagine until now. Dawn brought clear skies and the realization that the mining road ahead had been partially washed away by the storm. They were forced to make a detour that cost them precious time, picking their way carefully along steep slopes where one wrong step could send horse and rider tumbling into the ravines below. By midday, they had made less progress than Frederick had hoped, and his concern was evident in the tightness around his eyes, the frequent glances over his shoulder. "What's wrong?" Sarah Jane asked when they paused to rest the horses. "We're too exposed here," he replied, scanning the ridgelines above them, "and we're falling behind schedule." "Could Miles' men have found us?" Matthew asked, his hand straying to the pistol at his hip. Frederick shook his head. "Not likely, but I don't want to take chances. We should push harder this afternoon, try to make up the lost time." They rode on, the terrain gradually becoming less mountainous as they descended toward the foothills that preceded the plains around Denver. By late afternoon, they had reached a section of the old mining road that ran along a wide ledge, with a steep drop on one side and a towering cliff face on the other. Frederick held up his hand, signaling them to stop. "I don't like this," he said quietly. "Too easy for an ambush." As if summoned by his words, a shot rang out, the bullet striking the cliff face inches from Matthew's head. Stone chips flew, one cutting his cheek as he ducked instinctively. "Get down," Frederick shouted, drawing his gun and firing back at the unseen attacker. More shots followed, coming from somewhere above them on the cliff. They dismounted quickly, using the horses as partial cover while trying to locate the source of the gunfire. "There," Sarah Jane pointed to a flash of movement on a ledge about 50 feet above the road. Frederick aimed carefully and fired twice in rapid succession. There was a cry of pain, then silence. "Is he hit?" Matthew asked, pressing a handkerchief to his bleeding cheek. "Maybe," Frederick replied grimly, "but there could be more of them." As if in answer, another shot came from farther along the cliff, this one striking one of their horses. The animal screamed in pain and reared, nearly trampling Matthew before bolting down the road. "We need to move," Frederick urged, grabbing Sarah Jane's arm. "Head for those boulders ahead, they'll give us better cover." They ran, keeping low as more bullets kicked up dust around their feet. They had almost reached the boulders when Matthew suddenly stumbled, crying out in pain. "Matthew." Sarah Jane turned back, her heart stopping as she saw blood spreading across her brother's thigh. Frederick was at his side instantly, helping him up. Can you walk? Matthew nodded grimly, his face pale with pain. Just get me to cover. Together they half-carried, half-dragged Matthew to the shelter of the boulders. Once there, Frederick quickly examined the wound. The bullet went clean through, he reported. That's good, but he's losing blood. Sarah Jane tore a strip from her shirt to make a bandage. Who are they? Miles' deputies, bounty hunters, most likely, Frederick replied, peering cautiously around the edge of the boulder. I count at least 3 of them. They've got us pinned down. What do we do? Sarah Jane asked, trying to keep the fear from her voice as she tightened the makeshift bandage around Matthew's leg. Frederick's expression was grim but determined. I'll draw their fire. When I do, you and Matthew make for those trees about 100 yards down the road. Take the remaining horses. No, Sarah Jane protested. We're not leaving you here. It's the only way, Frederick insisted. Matthew needs medical attention, and you need to get that confession to Judge Parker. And what about you? She demanded, her voice breaking. What happens to you? Frederick's expression softened as he met her gaze. I'll be right behind you, I promise. The echo of his words from the night before hung between them, the same promise in a very different context. Sarah Jane wanted to believe him, but fear clutched at her heart. There has to be another way, she insisted. Matthew's voice broke in, weak but determined. He's right, Sarah Jane. We can't all make it out of here together, not with me slowing us down. He gripped his sister's hand. Let Frederick do this. It's our best chance. Sarah Jane looked between her brother and Frederick, torn between her fear of losing either of them. You have to promise me you'll follow us, she said finally to Frederick, her voice fierce with emotion. You have to promise you won't do anything foolish. A slight smile touched Frederick's lips. I promise to try. Before she could protest further, he pressed something into her hand, a folded paper sealed with wax. If I don't make it, give this to Judge Parker along with the confession. It contains everything I know about Miles and his operations. Names, dates, details. Sarah Jane's fingers closed around the document, her heart sinking at what it represented, Frederick's acknowledgement that he might not survive. I won't need this, she said, trying to sound confident, because you're going to be right behind us. Frederick's eyes held hers for a long moment. Then, in a gesture that surprised her, he leaned forward and kissed her briefly but fiercely. For luck, he murmured as he pulled away. Without giving her time to respond, he moved to the edge of their cover. Get ready. When I start shooting, count to 5, then run. Don't look back, no matter what you hear. Sarah Jane helped Matthew to his feet, supporting him as best she could. Her heart pounded in her chest, every fiber of her being rebelling against the plan even as she recognized its necessity. Frederick took a deep breath, then stepped out from behind the boulder, firing rapidly at the positions where the bounty hunters were concealed. The air filled with the sound of gunshots as they returned fire, all their attention focused on the lone figure who had exposed himself. 1, 2, 3. Sarah Jane counted under her breath, her arm around Matthew's waist. 4, 5. They broke cover, running as fast as Matthew's injury would allow toward the trees Frederick had indicated. Sarah Jane's ears were filled with the continuing exchange of gunfire behind them, each shot making her flinch with fear for Frederick. Don't look back, he had said. But as they reached the edge of the trees, Sarah Jane couldn't help herself. She turned just for an instant, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Frederick was pinned down behind a small outcrop of rock, completely surrounded. As she watched, one of the bounty hunters moved to a position that would give him a clear shot. Frederick. She screamed, her voice lost in the din of gunfire. A shot rang out, different from the others, louder, more precise. The bounty hunter who had been about to fire on Frederick suddenly crumpled to the ground. Confused, Sarah Jane scanned the area and spotted a lone rider on the ridge above, rifle in hand. Even at this distance, she recognized the massive figure of Hank Booker. More shots followed as Booker picked off the remaining bounty hunters with methodical precision. Within moments, the gunfire had ceased entirely. Frederick emerged from his cover, waving to Booker in acknowledgement before running toward Sarah Jane and Matthew. Are you all right? He asked as he reached them, his eyes quickly scanning them for new injuries. Sarah Jane could only nod, relief making her knees weak. Booker saved you. He did, Frederick agreed, glancing back at the ridge where the older man was now making his way down toward them. Though I'd like to know how he knew we needed saving. When Booker joined them a few minutes later, he explained gruffly, followed your trail, figured Miles would have men watching the routes to Denver. He nodded toward Matthew. How bad is it? Bad enough, Frederick replied. He needs a doctor. Booker considered this. There's a settlement about 5 miles east of here. Not much more than a trading post, but they've got someone who knows medicine. Lead the way, Frederick said, helping Matthew onto one of the remaining horses. As they set off, Sarah Jane rode alongside Frederick. Thank you, she said quietly. For keeping your promise, he glanced at her, a smile touching his lips. I try not to make promises I can't keep. The trading post turned out to be a cluster of rough buildings serving the scattered homesteads and mining claims in the area. The doctor was an elderly woman named Ruth Wilson who had learned medicine from her physician father and had been treating the locals for decades. She examined Matthew's wound with practiced hands, her assessment delivered in terse, no-nonsense language. Clean shot, missed the bone, he's lucky. She looked up at them. He'll need to stay off that leg for at least a week, preferably 2. We don't have a week, Frederick said grimly. We need to reach Denver as soon as possible. Mrs. Wilson fixed him with a stern gaze. You put him back on a horse tomorrow, that wound will open up again. He could bleed out or get an infection. Your choice. Frederick, Sarah Jane, and Booker stepped outside to discuss their options. I can stay with Matthew, Booker offered. You two go on to Denver. Frederick shook his head. If Miles has men watching the roads, you'll need help protecting him. I could stay, Sarah Jane suggested. You and Booker take the confession to Judge Parker. No, Frederick said firmly. You need to be there. Your testimony about what happened in Redemption Creek is crucial. They were at an impasse, each option presenting its own dangers. What if we split up differently? Sarah Jane proposed after a moment of thought. Booker stays with Matthew, but instead of heading to Denver, they go somewhere Miles wouldn't think to look. Like where? Frederick asked. Back to Redemption Creek, she suggested. Right under Miles' nose. Frederick's eyebrows shot up in surprise. That's either the most foolish idea I've ever heard or the most brilliant. Miles will have most of his men watching the roads to Denver, Sarah Jane reasoned. He won't expect us to double back to the very place we fled from. And there are people in town who might help people who were uncomfortable with Matthew's near hanging but too afraid to speak up before. Booker nodded slowly. The girl has a point. And if you two can get the territorial governor involved, having witnesses in Redemption Creek ready to testify could be valuable. Frederick considered the plan, his tactical mind evaluating its strengths and weaknesses. It's risky, he admitted, but it might work. He turned to Booker. You'd need to keep Matthew hidden until we send word that it's safe. I know a few people in that town who owe me favors, Booker replied. We'll manage. The decision made, they spent the night at the trading post preparing for their separate journeys. Mrs. Wilson provided them with fresh medical supplies for Matthew and directions to Denver that would keep Frederick and Sarah Jane off the main roads. As darkness fell, Sarah Jane found herself sitting alone on the trading post's small porch, watching the stars emerge one by one. The events of the past week swirled in her mind: the near hanging, the escape, the growing feelings for the quiet, determined man who had saved her brother's life. The creak of the door announced Frederick's presence before he spoke. Mind if I join you? She looked up with a smile. Please do. He sat beside her on the rough bench, their shoulders nearly touching. For a while they sat in companionable silence, the night sounds of the wilderness surrounding them. Are you scared? Frederick asked eventually. Sarah Jane considered the question. Yes, she admitted. But not as much as I would have been a week ago. What changed? She turned to look at him, her expression sincere. I met a man who taught me that courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about doing what's right despite the fear. Frederick's gaze softened. I think you already knew that. You just needed reminding. Perhaps, she conceded. Or perhaps I needed someone to show me that I wasn't alone in the fight. Frederick's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining as naturally as if they had been doing it for years. "You're not alone, Sarah Jane, not anymore." The simple promise held so much meaning, far more than either of them could articulate in that moment. It spoke of shared dangers overcome, of trust built in the crucible of adversity, of a future that might hold more than either had dared to hope for. As they sat together under the vast canopy of stars, Sarah Jane felt a sense of peace despite the challenges that still lay ahead. Whatever happened in Denver, whatever dangers they might yet face, they would face them together. And somehow that made all the difference. The journey to Denver took 2 more days, during which Frederick and Sarah Jane traveled cross-country, avoiding roads and settlements whenever possible. They spoke little during the day, focusing on covering ground quickly while remaining vigilant for any sign of pursuit. At night, however, as they sat beside their small campfire, the barriers between them continued to fall. Frederick shared stories of his childhood in Missouri, of his time as a soldier despite his youth, of the years after the war when he and James had traveled west seeking opportunity. Sarah Jane told him about growing up on the ranch, about her parents' dreams for their children, about her own hopes for the future. With each conversation, the connection between them deepened, evolving from the initial spark of attraction into something more profound, a meeting of minds and hearts that neither had anticipated when their paths first crossed. They reached Denver late on the second day, the city's lights spreading out before them as they crested a rise just as the sun was setting. The territorial capital was larger and more developed than Sarah Jane had expected, with brick buildings, gaslit streets, and an air of permanence that contrasted sharply with the rough frontier towns she was accustomed to. "It's so big," she murmured, momentarily overwhelmed by the prospect of navigating this unfamiliar urban landscape. Frederick gave her a reassuring smile. "It's not so bad once you get used to it, and we won't be staying long, just long enough to meet with Judge Parker and set things in motion." They found lodging at a modest hotel on the outskirts of town, using the names Smith and Jones to avoid detection. Frederick insisted on separate rooms, mindful of Sarah Jane's reputation despite the undeniable shift in their relationship. "I'll go see Judge Parker first thing in the morning," he told her as they parted for the night. "It's better if I approach him alone initially. Some men in positions of authority can be dismissive of women's testimony." Sarah Jane bristled at this but recognized the practical wisdom in his suggestion. "Just make sure he understands that I expect to be heard as well." Frederick smiled at her fierce expression. "Oh, I'll make that abundantly clear. Get some rest. Tomorrow could be a long day." Sleep proved elusive for Sarah Jane, her mind too full of questions and concerns. What if Judge Parker didn't believe them? What if Sheriff Miles had already spread his lies to the territorial officials? What if they had sent Matthew and Booker into a trap by directing them back to Redemption Creek? She was still awake when dawn broke, bringing with it a renewed determination. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the same courage that had brought her this far. Frederick met her for breakfast in the hotel's small dining room, his expression guarded but hopeful. "I've sent word to Judge Parker requesting a meeting. His clerk says he can see us at 10 o'clock. "Both of us," Sarah Jane confirmed. Frederick nodded. "I made it clear that your testimony is essential." As they waited for the appointed hour, Sarah Jane found herself growing increasingly nervous. She had changed back into a proper dress purchased the previous evening from a shop near the hotel, and now felt uncomfortably constrained after days in more practical attire. "You look very nice," Frederick observed as they prepared to leave for the judge's office. Sarah Jane smoothed the skirt of the simple blue dress. "I feel like I'm wearing a costume. Think of it as armor," he suggested. "Sometimes appearances matter, especially in places like this." Judge Ezekiel Parker's office was located in a stately brick building near the center of Denver. As they entered, Sarah Jane was struck by the atmosphere of quiet authority, the polished wooden furniture, the leather-bound law books lining the walls, the respectful tones of the clerks and officials who moved through the corridors. They were shown into the judge's private office promptly at 10. Judge Parker was a tall, thin man with a shock of white hair and penetrating gray eyes that seemed to assess and evaluate everything they fell upon. He rose from behind his desk as they entered, extending a hand to Frederick. "Mr. Kincaid, it's been some time." "Yes, sir." "Thank you for seeing us on such short notice." The judge turned his attention to Sarah Jane, his expression betraying nothing of his thoughts. "And this must be Miss Lawson. Please, both of you, be seated." Over the next hour, they laid out their case, Frederick providing the broader context of Sheriff Miles' corruption, and Sarah Jane detailing the specific events surrounding Matthew's near hanging. They presented the signed confession from the real horse thief and Frederick's own documented observations of similar abuses of power in other towns. Throughout their presentation, Judge Parker remained impassive, asking occasional clarifying questions but giving no indication of his thoughts on the matter. When they had finished, he sat back in his chair, fingers steepled before him. "These are serious accusations," he said finally. "Sheriff Miles has been in his position for nearly a decade. He has connections throughout the territory." "That doesn't make him innocent," Frederick replied evenly. "No, it doesn't," the judge agreed, "but it does make him dangerous." He fixed his gray eyes on Sarah Jane. "Are you prepared, Miss Lawson, for what might happen if we proceed with this case? There will be a formal hearing. You will need to testify under oath. Your character will be questioned. Your motives will be impugned." Sarah Jane met his gaze steadily. "My brother was nearly hanged for a crime he didn't commit. Our family's land is being stolen. If standing up to that injustice means enduring some unpleasantness in a courtroom, I'm more than prepared." Something like approval flickered in the judge's expression. "And your brother, where is he now?" Frederick answered this question. "Recovering from a bullet wound sustained when bounty hunters almost certainly hired by Miles ambushed us on the way to Denver." "I see." Judge Parker was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I will need to confer with the territorial governor on this matter. If what you say is true, and I have no reason to doubt it, given the evidence you've presented, then we're looking at a systematic abuse of power that extends beyond one sheriff in one town." "How long will that take?" Sarah Jane asked, unable to keep the impatience from her voice. "The governor is currently in Colorado Springs. I can send a telegraph today. With luck, I might have an answer by tomorrow." The judge rose, indicating that the meeting was concluding. "In the meantime, I suggest you both remain in Denver and maintain a low profile. Sheriff Miles may well have contacts here." As they left the judge's office, Sarah Jane felt a mixture of hope and frustration. "So now we wait," she said as they stepped onto the busy street. "Now we wait," Frederick confirmed. "But not idly. There are other people in Denver who might be useful to our cause: newspaper editors, political figures, other victims of Miles' corruption. The more voices we can add to our complaint, the stronger our position will be." They spent the remainder of the day seeking out these potential allies, with mixed success. Some were sympathetic but hesitant to involve themselves in what they saw as a local dispute. Others were more receptive, particularly a young newspaper editor named Martin Reynolds, who had been collecting stories of frontier injustice for a series of articles. "Miles isn't the only corrupt sheriff in the territory," Reynolds told them as they sat in his cluttered office. "But he's one of the worst. I've heard rumors about him for years, but finding people willing to go on record has been nearly impossible." "Well, you've found two now," Sarah Jane said firmly. Reynolds studied her with newfound respect. "So I have. And if Judge Parker is taking an interest, others will follow." He picked up a pencil and began making notes. "I can have a preliminary article ready for tomorrow's edition. Nothing specific about your case yet, just raising questions about the pattern of land seizures around Redemption Creek. It might smoke out other victims, encourage them to come forward." "That would be helpful," Frederick agreed. "The more witnesses we have, the harder it will be for Miles to dismiss our claims." As they left the newspaper office, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows down Denver's streets. They walked back toward their hotel, both lost in thought about the day's developments. "You think it will be enough?" Sarah Jane asked finally. Judge Parker seemed cautious. "He's a careful man," Frederick replied, "but he's also fair. If the evidence supports our case and I believe it does, he'll act." He glanced at her, noting the worry in her expression. "Try not to dwell on it tonight. We've done what we can for now." They had dinner in a small restaurant near their hotel, the conversation gradually shifting from their legal challenges to more personal topics. It was almost possible, in that quiet, candle-lit space, to forget the circumstances that had brought them together, to imagine they were simply a man and woman enjoying each other's company. As they walked the short distance back to the hotel, Frederick suddenly tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "What is it?" Sarah Jane asked, immediately alert. "Don't look now, but there's a man across the street who's been following us since we left the restaurant." Frederick's voice was low, his expression casual despite the warning in his words. "Keep walking normally." Sarah Jane complied, resisting the urge to look over her shoulder. "Do you think he's one of Miles' men? Could be, or he could be working for someone else entirely." Frederick guided her around a corner, then suddenly pulled her into the shadows of an alleyway. "Stay here," he whispered, drawing his gun. Before she could protest, he had slipped back to the corner, positioning himself to intercept their follower. Sarah Jane held her breath, straining to hear what was happening. There was a brief scuffle, then Frederick's voice, hard with warning. "Who sent you?" A second voice, unfamiliar and breathless. "Nobody, I swear. You've been following us for 3 blocks. Try again." All right. "Sheriff Miles is offering $500 for information about the Lawson girl and the gunslinger who helped her brother escape. That's all I know." There was a moment of silence, then Frederick spoke again, his tone deadly serious. "You're going to walk away now. You're going to forget you saw us, because if Miles finds out where we are, I'll know exactly who told him. Understood?" "Why, yes, sir." "Go." Frederick returned to the alleyway where Sarah Jane waited, his expression grim. "Miles has put the word out. We're not safe here." "What do we do?" Sarah Jane asked, her heart racing. "Change hotels, for a start, and tomorrow we stay close to Judge Parker's office. Miles won't risk making a move in the territorial court building." They found new accommodations at a larger, more anonymous hotel near the center of Denver. As they stood in the lobby after securing their rooms, Frederick's concern was evident in the tightness around his eyes. "I don't like leaving you alone tonight," he admitted quietly. "I'll be fine," Sarah Jane assured him, though her own confidence was shaken by the knowledge that Miles' reach extended even to Denver. "My room has a good lock, and I still have the Derringer you gave me." Frederick nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. "If anything happens, anything at all, you call out. I'll be in the room directly across the hall." "I will," she promised. Then, in a moment of boldness, she stretched up on tiptoe and kissed his cheek. "Thank you for watching over me." A hint of color touched Frederick's face, visible even in the dim light of the hotel lobby. "It's no hardship," he said softly. They parted for the night, but sleep eluded Sarah Jane once again. Every creak of the old hotel, every footstep in the corridor outside her door, sent her heart racing with apprehension. She kept the Derringer on the nightstand beside her bed, a small but reassuring presence in the darkness. Dawn found her exhausted but determined. Whatever happened today with Judge Parker would set the course for their future, for Matthew's freedom, for the fate of their ranch, for the possibility of justice in Redemption Creek. And perhaps, she thought as she dressed for the day, for whatever might be developing between her and Frederick as well. They met for breakfast in the hotel's dining room, both showing signs of a restless night. Frederick's eyes were shadowed with fatigue, his expression alert but strained. "Any trouble?" he asked as she sat down across from him. "None," she replied, "though I don't think I closed my eyes all night." A sympathetic smile touched his lips. "That makes 2 of us." They had just finished their meal when a hotel employee approached their table. "Mr. Smith, there's a message for you at the front desk." Frederick exchanged a quick glance with Sarah Jane before following the man to retrieve the message. He returned moments later, a folded note in his hand. "It's from Judge Parker," he said quietly, sitting down again. "He wants to see us immediately." The urgency of the summons set Sarah Jane's nerves on edge. "Did something happen?" "He doesn't say." Frederick stood, offering her his arm, but I suppose we'll find out soon enough. The streets of Denver were busy with morning traffic as they made their way to the judge's office. Frederick remained vigilant, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for any sign of the previous night's follower or other potential threats. They were shown into Judge Parker's office without delay. The judge was not alone. A well-dressed man with a neatly trimmed beard and an air of authority stood beside him. "Mr. Kincaid, Miss Lawson," Judge Parker greeted them. "Allow me to introduce Governor Richard Adams." Sarah Jane's heart skipped a beat. The presence of the territorial governor himself suggested that their case was being taken more seriously than she had dared to hope. "Governor," Frederick acknowledged with a respectful nod. "Please sit down," the governor invited, his manner brisk but not unfriendly. "Judge Parker has briefed me on your situation. I must say the evidence you've presented is disturbing." "Then you believe us?" Sarah Jane asked, unable to contain the question. Governor Adams' expression turned grave. "Miss Lawson, corruption among frontier lawmen is unfortunately not uncommon. What makes your case particularly concerning is the apparent collaboration between Sheriff Miles and local business interests to systematically deprive legitimate landowners of their property." "It's theft," Sarah Jane said firmly. "Plain and simple." "Indeed it is," the governor agreed. "And it will not be tolerated in Colorado territory. I've authorized Judge Parker to convene a special hearing to investigate these allegations." Relief washed over Sarah Jane, so profound that she felt momentarily lightheaded. Frederick's hand found hers beneath the table, a steadying presence. "When will this hearing take place?" Frederick asked. "I've already sent telegraphs to several relevant parties," Judge Parker replied. "The hearing will begin 3 days from now. In the meantime, I'm dispatching federal marshals to Redemption Creek to ensure that no further irregularities occur." "My brother," Sarah Jane began, "will be safe," the governor assured her. "The marshals have instructions to locate and protect him. They're also carrying writs that temporarily suspend Sheriff Miles from his duties pending the outcome of the hearing." The comprehensive nature of their response left Sarah Jane speechless. After days of running, fighting, and fearing for their lives, the swift and decisive action of the territorial authorities seemed almost too good to be true. "Thank you," she managed finally. "Both of you." "Don't thank us yet, Miss Lawson," Judge Parker cautioned. "This is only the beginning. Sheriff Miles will not surrender his position or his cousin's plans for your land without a fight. The hearing will be contentious, and you must be prepared for that." "I am," she replied with quiet determination. "Good." The judge exchanged a glance with the governor before continuing. "There is one more matter we need to discuss. It concerns you, Mr. Kincaid." Frederick straightened, his expression wary. "Sir." "In reviewing your documentation of Sheriff Miles' activities, I couldn't help but notice references to certain interventions you've made in other jurisdictions." Judge Parker's tone was carefully neutral. "While your intentions appear honorable, your methods have occasionally strayed outside the boundaries of the law." Sarah Jane felt Frederick tense beside her. "I've done what was necessary to protect innocent lives," he said evenly. "So it seems," the governor interjected. "And that's precisely why I'd like to make you an offer." Frederick raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "What kind of offer?" Colorado territory is growing rapidly. Law and order struggle to keep pace. We need men who understand frontier justice but respect the rule of law. Governor Adams leaned forward slightly. "I'm proposing to appoint you as a special investigator under my office's authority. You would have the power to look into allegations of corruption among territorial officials, including sheriffs and judges." The offer clearly caught Frederick off guard. He was silent for a long moment, considering, "That's not what I expected." "It would legitimize the work you're already doing," Judge Parker pointed out, "give you the authority to act openly rather than, well, as you have been." Sarah Jane watched Frederick's face, seeing the conflict there, the habitual independence warring with the recognition of what such a position could mean for his ability to effect real change. "I'd need to think about it," he said finally. "Of course," the governor replied. The offer remains open regardless of your decision about Sheriff Miles' case. He rose, signaling the end of the meeting. I look forward to seeing you both at the hearing. Until then, please continue to exercise caution. Sheriff Miles still has friends in Denver. As they left the building, Sarah Jane couldn't contain her excitement any longer. Frederick, this is wonderful. The governor himself is involved. They believe us. Frederick's expression remained cautious. It's a good start, he agreed. But Judge Parker was right. Miles won't go down without a fight. But now we have the law on our side, she pointed out. Real law, not the corrupted version Miles represents. A smile finally broke through Frederick's reserve. Yes, we do. He took her hand, squeezing it gently. You were magnificent in there, by the way, standing up to the governor and judge as if you faced down territorial officials every day. Sarah Jane felt her cheeks warm at the praise. I was terrified, she admitted. But I kept thinking about what you told me, that courage isn't about not being afraid. Frederick's expression softened as he looked at her. You're one of the bravest people I've ever met, Sarah Jane Lawson. The sincerity in his voice made her heart swell. For a moment they stood there on the busy Denver street, oblivious to the people flowing around them, connected by something that had grown far beyond their initial alliance of necessity. What about the governor's offer? Sarah Jane asked finally. Will you accept it? Frederick's gaze turned thoughtful. I don't know. It would mean changing how I've lived for the past 3 years, answering to others, following procedures. It would also mean making a real difference, she pointed out. Changing the system from within rather than fighting it from the outside. Perhaps. He offered her his arm and they began walking back toward their hotel. But let's focus on one battle at a time. First, we deal with Sheriff Miles and get your ranch back. Then I'll consider the governor's proposal. Sarah Jane slipped her arm through his, a newfound hope lighting her steps. For the first time since Matthew's near hanging, she allowed herself to truly believe that they might prevail, that justice might be served, their home restored, their future secured. And as she glanced at the man beside her, she found herself wondering if that future might include Frederick Kincaid in a role very different from the solitary avenger he had been when they met. The 3 days before the hearing passed in a whirlwind of activity. Sarah Jane and Frederick worked closely with Judge Parker's staff, providing detailed statements and helping to locate additional witnesses who could testify to Sheriff Miles' corruption. Martin Reynolds, true to his word, published an article questioning the pattern of land seizures around Redemption Creek. The piece prompted several former residents to come forward with stories similar to the Lawsons' tales of trumped-up charges, forced sales, and threats backed by the sheriff's badge. On the morning of the hearing, Sarah Jane stood before the mirror in her hotel room, smoothing the front of her best dress, a new garment purchased specifically for the occasion. Her reflection showed a young woman transformed by adversity, still recognizably the ranch girl from Redemption Creek, but with a new confidence in her posture, a new determination in her eyes. A knock at her door announced Frederick's arrival. When she opened it, she found him similarly transformed by formal attire, a crisp white shirt, dark suit, and string tie replacing his usual trail-worn clothing. He had trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair, looking every inch the respectable witness rather than the dangerous gunman Sheriff Miles had likely described. You look beautiful, he said softly, his eyes warm with admiration. And you look like someone who might actually accept the governor's offer, she replied with a smile. A hint of color touched his cheeks. We'll see, he offered her his arm. Ready as I'll ever be. The territorial courthouse was an imposing structure of red brick and white stone, its high ceilings and polished wooden fixtures designed to inspire respect for the law it represented. The hearing room was already crowded when they arrived, filled with spectators drawn by Reynolds' articles and the rumors circulating through Denver's political circles. Sarah Jane scanned the faces anxiously, looking for her brother. Do you see Matthew? Before Frederick could answer, a side door opened, and Matthew appeared, accompanied by Hank Booker and a tall man wearing a federal marshal's badge. Though Matthew still walked with a slight limp, he looked healthy and determined. "Sarah Jane," he crossed the room to embrace his sister. "Are you all right? They wouldn't let us contact you before the hearing." "I'm fine," she assured him, blinking back tears of relief. "What about you?" "Your leg, healing well," he replied. "Booker got me to a doctor in a town near Redemption Creek. We've been staying with friends until the marshal found us yesterday." Further conversation was interrupted as Judge Parker entered the room, followed by two other officials who would form the panel overseeing the hearing. Everyone rose as they took their seats at the elevated bench. "This special hearing is now in session," Judge Parker announced, his authoritative voice silencing the murmurs that had filled the room. "We are here to investigate allegations of misconduct against Sheriff Bartholomew Miles of Redemption Creek, and to determine whether said misconduct warrants his removal from office and potential criminal charges." A door at the back of the room opened, and Sheriff Miles himself entered, flanked by two deputies and a well-dressed man who Sarah Jane assumed was his lawyer. Miles' gaze swept the room, his expression darkening when he spotted the Lawson siblings and Frederick. The proceedings began with the presentation of evidence documents showing suspicious patterns in land sales around Redemption Creek, testimony from former residents who had been driven from their homes by Miles' tactics, the signed confession from the real horse thief that Frederick had obtained. When it was Sarah Jane's turn to testify, she approached the witness stand with her head held high, ignoring Sheriff Miles' glare from across the room. She recounted the events leading to Matthew's arrest, the hasty trial, and the near hanging that had been interrupted by Frederick's timely arrival. "And you believe these actions were motivated by a desire to seize your family's property?" Judge Parker asked. "I know they were," Sarah Jane replied firmly. "Sheriff Miles' cousin, Edmund Blackwell, had been trying to buy our ranch for years. When we refused to sell, suddenly my brother was accused of horse theft, a crime punishable by hanging. The timing was not coincidental." Miles' lawyer objected, claiming speculation, but Judge Parker allowed the testimony to stand. Matthew testified next, providing his account of the events and identifying one of Miles' deputies as the man who had planted evidence on him. Frederick followed, his testimony more technical as he outlined the broader pattern of corruption he had documented across several counties. Throughout the morning, Sheriff Miles sat stone-faced, occasionally leaning to whisper to his lawyer but otherwise showing no reaction to the mounting evidence against him. His turn came after the midday recess, when he took the stand to defend himself. "These accusations are nothing but the desperate lies of criminals seeking to escape justice," he declared, his voice ringing with practiced indignation. Matthew Lawson was caught red-handed with stolen property. The fact that he escaped lawful punishment with the help of this vigilante, he jabbed a finger toward Frederick, only confirms his guilt. "And how do you explain the signed confession from the real thief?" Judge Parker asked. Miles scoffed. "Coerced, no doubt. Kincaid has a reputation for extracting whatever truth serves his purposes." The questioning continued, with Miles maintaining his innocence and dismissing all evidence against him as fabrications or misunderstandings. He was a skilled performer, Sarah Jane had to admit, convincing in his righteous anger, plausible in his explanations. As the afternoon wore on, she began to worry. What if the judges believed Miles? What if all their efforts, all their risks had been for nothing? Frederick seemed to sense her concern. During a brief recess, he leaned close to whisper, "Don't worry, Parker isn't fooled by his act." "How can you be sure?" "Because we have one more witness they don't know about yet." Before she could ask who he meant, the hearing resumed. Judge Parker called a final witness, a name Sarah Jane didn't recognize. A middle-aged man in a business suit entered the courtroom, pointedly avoiding Sheriff Miles' gaze as he approached the witness stand. Miles, for his part, suddenly looked considerably less confident. "Please state your name and occupation for the record," Judge Parker instructed. "Harold Wilson. I'm the banker in Redemption Creek." "And what is your relationship to Sheriff Bartholomew Miles?" Wilson cleared his throat nervously. I've handled his financial affairs for the past 8 years. Including certain unofficial transactions? Yes, sir. Wilson glanced briefly at Miles, whose face had drained of color. Sheriff Miles instructed me to establish a separate account where he deposited funds that didn't align with his official salary. A murmur swept through the courtroom at this revelation. And where did these funds come from, Mr. Wilson? Various sources. Edmund Blackwell was a regular contributor, so were several other businessmen with interests in properties around Redemption Creek. Wilson's voice strengthened as he continued. The pattern was always the same. Someone would refuse to sell their land, then suddenly find themselves in legal trouble. After they were forced to sell, usually at well below market value, a payment would appear in Miles' special account. Sheriff Miles surged to his feet. That's a damned lie. Order. Judge Parker banged his gavel. Sheriff, you will have an opportunity to respond to this testimony. But the damage was done. As Wilson continued, providing specific dates, amounts, and names, the full extent of Miles' corruption became undeniable. By the time the banker finished testifying, even Miles' own deputies were distancing themselves, unwilling to be associated with such blatant abuse of power. The panel of judges retired to deliberate, leaving the courtroom buzzing with speculation. Sarah Jane, Matthew, and Frederick waited anxiously, none of them quite believing that the end of their ordeal might be in sight. "How did you find the banker?" Sarah Jane asked Frederick quietly. "I didn't," he admitted. "Judge Parker did. Apparently, Wilson had been keeping records of Miles' illegal activities as insurance against the day the sheriff might turn on him." "Smart man," Matthew observed. The judges returned after less than an hour, their expressions grave as they resumed their seats. The courtroom fell silent, all eyes on Judge Parker as he prepared to deliver their decision. After reviewing the evidence presented today, this panel finds the allegations against Sheriff Bartholomew Miles to be substantiated beyond reasonable doubt. He has systematically abused his authority for personal gain, perverted the course of justice, and violated the trust placed in him by the people of Redemption Creek and the territory of Colorado. A collective gasp went up from the spectators, followed by a swell of conversation that the judge silenced with his gavel. Sheriff Miles is hereby removed from office, effective immediately. He will remain in custody pending formal criminal charges, which will include corruption, extortion, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Judge Parker's gaze moved to where Matthew and Sarah Jane sat. Furthermore, all legal actions taken by Sheriff Miles against Matthew Lawson are declared null and void. Mr. Lawson's record is to be expunged, and any property seized or transferred under duress is to be restored to its rightful owners. Tears of relief and vindication filled Sarah Jane's eyes. Frederick's hand found hers, squeezing gently in shared triumph. "This hearing is adjourned," Judge Parker declared, bringing down his gavel with finality. As the courtroom erupted in conversation, Sheriff Miles was taken into custody by federal marshals. The man who had terrorized Redemption Creek for years suddenly looked small and defeated, his power stripped away. His future now bounded by prison walls rather than the wide, open spaces of the frontier. Outside the courthouse, Sarah Jane, Matthew, Frederick, and Booker stood together in the late afternoon sunlight, still processing the outcome of the hearing. "It's over," Matthew said wonderingly. "We can go home." "Yes," Sarah Jane agreed, though her gaze drifted to Frederick. "We can go home." Frederick caught her look, understanding the unspoken question in her eyes. Before he could respond, Governor Adams approached their group. "Congratulations," he said, shaking hands with each of them. "Justice has been served today, thanks in large part to your courage in coming forward." "Thank you, Governor," Sarah Jane replied. "We couldn't have done it without your support." The governor nodded, then turned his attention to Frederick. "Have you given any further thought to my offer, Mr. Kincaid?" Frederick hesitated, his eyes meeting Sarah Jane's briefly before he answered. "I have, sir, and I'm interested, but I'd like to propose a modification." "Oh," the governor raised an eyebrow. "What sort of modification?" I'd like to establish a base of operations in Redemption Creek, Frederick said. It's centrally located for the areas that have experienced the most corruption, and, he glanced at Sarah Jane again, I have reason to believe I might find accommodations there. Sarah Jane's heart soared at his words and the future they implied. The governor, noting the exchange of looks between them, smiled knowingly. I believe that could be arranged, he said. We'll discuss the details when you return to Denver after getting the Lawsons settled back on their ranch. As the governor departed, Matthew clapped Frederick on the shoulder. So it seems my sister has convinced you to put down roots. Frederick's expression turned serious. If that's agreeable to both of you, I wouldn't want to impose, Matthew laughed. Impose? You saved my life and helped us get our ranch back. As far as I'm concerned, you're family now. He glanced at his sister, his eyes twinkling. Though I suspect Sarah Jane might have more specific ideas about your role. Sarah Jane felt her cheeks flush, but she met Frederick's gaze steadily. I do have some thoughts on the matter. I'd be very interested in hearing them, Frederick replied, his voice low and intimate despite their public setting. Booker cleared his throat loudly. If you two are finished making eyes at each other, perhaps we should discuss the practical matter of getting back to Redemption Creek. It's a long ride and there's much to be done. His gruff intervention broke the tension, drawing laughter from all of them. As they began walking toward their hotel to make preparations for the journey home, Frederick fell into step beside Sarah Jane, his hand finding hers naturally. Did you mean what you said to the governor? She asked quietly. About wanting to base yourself in Redemption Creek, Frederick smiled down at her, a smile that reached his eyes and erased the hardness that had been there when they first met. I meant every word, if you'll have me, that is. I think that could be arranged, Sarah Jane replied, echoing the governor's words with a smile of her own. After all, every ranch needs someone who's good with a gun, and every woman needs a man who's willing to fight for justice at the Noose. Frederick's laugh was warm and genuine, the laugh of a man who had found something he thought lost forever. Is that what I am to you? Just a hired gun? Sarah Jane stopped walking, turning to face him fully. No, Frederick Kincaid. You're the man who saved my brother, who helped me reclaim our home, who showed me that courage and honor still exist in this world. She reached up to touch his cheek gently. You're the man I've fallen in love with. The words, once spoken, seemed to hang in the air between them, a truth too long unacknowledged, now finally given voice. Frederick's expression softened, his eyes reflecting emotions too complex for simple words. Instead of speaking, he bent his head and kissed her, there on the busy Denver street, uncaring of who might see. When they finally broke apart, his voice was husky with feeling. I love you too, Sarah Jane Lawson, more than I thought possible when I rode into Redemption Creek that day. Matthew and Booker, who had continued walking, looked back to find them standing close together, lost in their own world. About time, Booker muttered, though his gruff tone couldn't quite hide his satisfaction. Matthew nodded in agreement. I'd say they've earned their happiness. And indeed, they had, through danger and sacrifice, through courage and determination, through fighting for justice when it would have been easier to surrender. They had earned not just the return of the Lawson Ranch, but the chance at a future neither had dared to imagine before their paths crossed beneath the shadow of the gallows. 2 months later, on a crisp autumn day, Sarah Jane stood on the porch of the Lawson Ranch house, watching as Frederick rode in from his latest assignment for the governor. The sight of him still made her heart beat faster, this man who had changed her life in ways she was still discovering. The ranch was flourishing again. With Miles gone and his cousin's land schemes exposed, the shadow that had hung over Redemption Creek had lifted. Matthew had thrown himself into expanding their horse breeding operation, his natural talent with the animals finally given free rein without the threat of persecution. Frederick dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post before climbing the porch steps to greet her with a kiss that still held all the wonder of their first. Welcome home, Sarah Jane said softly when they parted. Home, Frederick repeated, the words still carrying a note of pleasant surprise, as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune. I like the sound of that. They entered the house together, where Matthew was setting the table for dinner. The simple domestic scene, so different from the dangers they had faced just months before, never failed to fill Sarah Jane with gratitude. Later that evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Frederick took Sarah Jane's hand in his. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice carrying a hint of nervousness she rarely heard from him. "A dangerous pastime," she teased gently. He smiled at that. "Perhaps. But I've been thinking that while I enjoy my work for the governor, and I'm proud of the difference we're making in cleaning up corruption in the territory, there's something missing." "Oh," Sarah Jane turned to look at him more directly. "What's that?" Frederick reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "Official recognition of what we already know to be true." Sarah Jane's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring with a small, perfect diamond. "Sarah Jane Lawson," Frederick said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "You taught me that there are things in this world worth fighting for beyond justice and retribution. You showed me that it's possible to build something good and true, even in a place where men like Sheriff Miles would destroy it for their own gain." He took a deep breath. "I love you more than I ever thought possible. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of joy welled in Sarah Jane's eyes as she nodded, too overcome for words at first. "Yes," she finally managed. "Yes, Frederick Kincaid, I will marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger and gathered her into his arms, Sarah Jane reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the terror of Matthews, near hanging to the triumph of justice in Denver. From strangers thrown together by circumstance to partners bound by love and shared purpose. The rope that had nearly taken her brother's life had instead become the thread that tied her to this remarkable man, this former avenger who had found, in her love and in the peace of the Lawson Ranch, a new purpose and a true home. As the last light of day faded from the sky, giving way to the first stars of evening, Frederick and Sarah Jane remained on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms, their future stretching before them as vast and promising as the frontier itself, a future built on justice fought for and won, on love discovered in the most unlikely of circumstances, and on the unshakable foundation of two hearts that had found in each other exactly what they needed to be whole.